Period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise to speak briefly this afternoon on the ongoing crisis in Venezuela. There is a growing interest in the matter here among my colleagues in the Senate and in the White House and in other places, certainly in the press, and thankfully so. This has been going on now for a significant period of time. Just to put it into context, a lot of times when we talk about these sort of showdowns around the world, these sorts of internal strife, there's this notion that there's this government in place, and then there's this group that doesn't like the government, and they're arguing with each other about the future of the country. What's interesting in Venezuela is that both the opposition and the ruling party are in government. The government, obviously, on the presidential level, is controlled by someone who's turned himself into a dictator. He is a successor of Hugo Chavez. He's the president, Nicolas Maduro, and those who surround him. And then there is the National Assembly, elected by the people of Venezuela, the majority party in their legislative branch. And what has happened over the last year and a half is the president of Venezuela, Maduro, the now dictator, has nullified the legislative branch. He basically refuses to recognize the laws they pass, stopped allowing transfers. So basically, the National Assembly in Venezuela today, they're not getting paid. They have no funds for offices. They have no funds for material. And they'll pass a law, and those laws are ignored. And that is the ongoing crisis. The second part of it is that under their constitution, the Constitution of Venezuela, if you collected a certain number of signatures by December of this year, by the end of the year, they had to hold a referendum on the president, a recall referendum. They refused to certify the signatures, even though the people who collected them turned in 4 times as many signatures that was necessary. The third is they're supposed to have governor and legislative elections this year in Venezuela. Maduro has canceled those. And there is no telling, but it doesn't seem like they're going to have a presidential election either. Here's the bottom line. The strife in Venezuela that's going on today can be solved by an election of the people of Venezuela, by basically following their existing constitution. But that's not what they've allowed to have happen. And on the contrary, not only are they not allowing these elections to happen, but anyone who protests against it has been jailed, press kicked out of the country. CNN's been kicked out of Venezuela as an example. And now we're seeing reports of this escalating violence in the street, and it's extraordinary. And so what's interesting, though, is that fissures are beginning to develop. And the message we send here today, first of all, to those who are in the street fighting for democracy and for following the law and elections in Venezuela, is that we stand with you, and we'll never let your cause fall, and we'll never accept these ridiculous moves that Maduro is now doing to rewrite the Constitution yet again through a flawed and fraudulent process. But the second message we have is to the people in the Venezuelan government who do not want to be a part of what's happening. We see now examples, for example, of the Attorney General, Luisa Ortega, who is part of the Maduro government, has been largely friendly, but lately has begun to break away from the government, going as far as to criticize the government's escalating repression. You see it increasingly among the rank and file in the National Guard in Venezuela, who are all armored up like G.I. Joe, facing down these unarmed protesters. But on the other side of the protests are their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters, their wives, their husbands, and their friends and neighbors. And what's really troubling now is these armed groups, irregular groups, these militias that Maduro has armed and trained with the help of Cuban intelligence have spun completely out of control. These groups are going around randomly beating people up, setting up roadblocks, committing all sorts of acts of violence. These are not uniformed. These are collectives, as they call them, basically these armed militias outside of the government, funded, created by Maduro, who have now begun to spin out of control, even to the point where they themselves, I believe, are potentially threatened by these groups, who, in addition to funding themselves through the government, have found other ways to fund themselves through illicit means, including street crime. This situation is reaching a break point, and I think it's an important moment to remind the men and women in uniform in the National Guard of Venezuela that their job is to protect the people of Venezuela, not to oppress them. That their job is to protect and uphold the Constitution of that country, not to cancel it out. To remind them that the men and women on the other side of these protests are their family, their fellow Venezuelans. Now the time has come for men and women in the Venezuelan government, many who perhaps sympathize with Hugo Chavez and Maduro up to a point, that they do not want to go down with this ship, that they do not want to wind up on the list of people who participated in this crackdown and in this oppression. And I hope that my colleagues here will continue to work hard. I'm encouraged by the amount of bipartisan support that we've begun to create on the issue of Venezuela. I know my colleague Senator Cardin and I have worked out bipartisan legislation that urges the Maduro regime to release all its political prisoners and expresses support for a solution to the crisis. It urges my colleagues, I urge all my colleagues to join me in co-signing this bipartisan legislation. We also support the administration's efforts at the OAS to continue to work with regional governments in Argentina and Colombia, Mexico, Peru, Chile, and others who have taken heed of this issue and have played an extraordinary leadership role in raising this in international forums. And beyond that, I would encourage the administration to continue to look for names to sanction. They have the authority under the law, passed not once but twice by this Congress, that allows them to identify specific individuals within the Venezuelan government who are stealing the money of the Venezuelan people and committing grotesque human rights violations and have real estate and other personal property and cash deposits in bank accounts around the world from what they have illicitly stolen from the people of Venezuela. And here's my closing point. The government of Maduro is now relying on credit from all parts of the world in order to continue to sustain itself. I strongly urge any private investment banks, any of these large global banks who are thinking about lending money to Venezuela, you are abetting this regime and its repression. And you will be singled out and named if you participate in continuing to lend them money to fund this. To the Russian government, I say, you're not going to get your money back. These guys cannot pay you back. The same for the Chinese government. You continue to lend money to the Maduro regime, they will not be able to pay you back, and you're going to be embarrassed. The Chinese government is going to be embarrassed if they continue to loan money to Venezuela that they cannot and will never pay you back. And the Russians cannot afford to continue to lend money to a government that will not pay them back either. And so I urge them to look at that very carefully before they continue to embarrass themselves by lending out their people's money that they will never get back. This is an important issue. It's in our own hemisphere. And the answer lies one election away. If only the Maduro regime would follow its laws and its constitution, Venezuela would be on a better path that its people would choose. In the alternative, this situation will continue to spiral out of control. And we, in this chamber and in this country, will continue to be on the side of the men and women who seek nothing but democracy and seek nothing but peace and reconciliation and a way forward for this nation, which has a deep history of democratic order. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.